TikTok time to rock. Just kidding. I'm here with Dr. Mike Licona, and we're talking about 3 super weird theories, theories about the resurrection. And so I talked to Mike about this yesterday. I said, "Give me what are some of like the weirdest things that you've heard about the resurrection?" And we're going to get into that in a second. But if you don't know who Mike is, he's got a PhD in New Testament studies from Pretoria. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Pretoria University. He's one of the most premier experts on the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And what am I missing there? I'm sure that there's a lot more to say about you.
Oh, man. Got a wonderful wife, Debbie, of 33 years.
Who I just met.
Yep. And then I got 2 great kids. My oldest is Allie. She's married to a Christian apologist named Nick Peters. So it's Allie Peters. And then my son, Zach, he's a firefighter here in the Georgia metro area. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, well, let's get into it. So let's do these 3 super weird theories. What is the number 1 that comes to mind?
Number 1, like the one?
No.
Oh, 3, 2, 1?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So I would say number 3 would have to be the identical twin hypothesis. And that is to say that Jesus had an identical twin after he died and was buried. Someone took the body from the tomb, and then his identical twin brother shows up and says, "Hey, I'm Jesus. I'm raised from the dead."
Yeah, and so it's important to say when we're thinking about these theories, these aren't things that we're coming up with, or like Christians are just trying to make fun of people. We're not doing that. These are actual theories put forward by scholars. Is that right?
Yeah.
So who does this one? Who says this one?
There's only one person I know that did it.
Okay.
His name's Greg Cavan. He's an atheist philosophy professor out in California. Good guy. I've debated him. We had a good time, and say he's a friend. So what Greg did was he said, okay, let's just do a process of elimination here. And he says, hallucination hypothesis? He says, no. He says, Jesus surviving crucifixion? No. He said, so you just rule out all these other things, and the only thing you're really left with is Jesus had to have an identical twin. And he shows up and claims to be Jesus, and they think he's raised from the dead.
So why is this not a good theory?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Number 1, there's not a scrap of evidence for it. I mean, that would be a reason for it. Second, we'd say, well, I'd say over the years, I've probably, a lot of times when I'm lecturing, and if someone brings this up, I'll say, do we have any identical twins here? And usually there'll be some people that will raise their hands. And I'll always ask them, is there, can people tell the difference? And they'll say, well, yeah, we can fool people. I say, yeah, but people who know you, like your parents, your siblings, your spouses, your children, can you fool them for, say, more than 2 minutes? And in all but one case, they've always said, as soon as we start talking or moving, they can notice a difference.
Wow.
And just a facial expression, anything like that, there's enough difference in identical twins that those who really know them can tell the difference. Now, there was someone just a couple of years ago, I think I was in Michigan, and the woman said that she could fool the husband of her identical twin sister, probably for a significant period of time. And that a lot of people laughed, So, I mean, you can think of some scenarios, but
one of the things that comes to my mind, have you seen that movie Prestige? Did you watch that movie with Christian Bale? Christian Bale and who was it, Matt? Who else was in this movie? He was Australian.
You say Matt.
He was the Wolverine guy. Matt Fradd is. You want to pop in for a second? You don't have to.
I don't know. Prestige.
Oh goodness!
Yeah, I'll look it up.
He was Wolverine.
I'll yell it out.
He was Wolverine.
Oh, that bloke.
Hey!
1 second.
Oh my goodness! Why can I not think of his name? Anyways, we know the movie we're talking. We'll get his name in a second. Yeah. So yeah, it kind of reminds me of that movie, and even in that movie, it was super difficult. Hugh Jackman.
Yeah, so I mean that would be a problem there. His disciples had traveled around with him for 1.5 to 3 years. And spend all this time with him. It's not just every once in a while. They're with him day in and day out. So
yeah, right, exactly.
They should be able to tell the difference.
And if you spent some time with anybody and you were like, oh yeah, do you remember that time when this happened? And if they just had no clue, it just seems so implausible.
That's exactly right.
They would have to go really far out of their way to like recount everything that happened that day, every day. It's just Anyways.
And the only way to overcome that would be to say, okay, he would have to know what Jesus was saying all along, which means that this identical twin brother was traveling with them. But then if that were the case, then, and he's the identical twin is saying, hey, I'm Jesus, well, then what happened to his brother, right? Because he's no longer around.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of problems with this. And in fact, Greg told me right before we debated a few years back that he no longer holds that view. So I don't know anyone who holds that view.
But it has been propounded.
Yeah.
Or it's come up. All right, let's move on to number 2. What is the number 2 weirdest theory about the resurrection?
Well, that would have to be offered by James Tabor, who is a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And back in, I believe it's 2006, he wrote a book, came out called The Jesus Dynasty. And in there, he one of the things when it comes to the death and resurrection of Jesus, he says, we can know that Jesus died. But then what happened to his body? Now, he grants that Jesus was buried in a tomb. And he says, but none of the tombs that are we see in Jerusalem now are the actual ones. So the garden tomb, he says it wasn't a garden tomb, and he gives some reasons. And I think he's right with that, because I don't know scholars who think that the garden tomb, I mean...
Isn't it too old? Is it too old or too...
I think it's too old.
Too old. About 800 years out of date, from what I remember.
I think Tabor puts it 5th century BC. So... even if that's the case, I've been to Jerusalem twice, been to the Garden Tomb twice, and I don't know of scholars who think that that's the actual tomb of Jesus. Most think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is where Jesus was buried, that's Golgotha and where he was buried. Tabor says no, and because that
to
tradition,
the Church of the Holy Sepulchre,
to the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because he says the earliest tradition we have for that is 4th century. So we're talking 300 years after Jesus. So what Tabor does, he says, well, where is Jesus buried? Okay, he posits, because there's a testimony of a rabbi from the 16th century, that says that Jesus was buried in Galilee. So he doesn't like 4th century, but he goes with 16th century. The 16th century Kabbalistic rabbi who says Jesus was buried in Galilee. And he starts off, he says, look, historians must go by a scientific view of reality. And we know that people aren't born of a virgin, so therefore Jesus' virgin birth never occurred. And we know that when people die, they stay dead, so the resurrection didn't occur. And if the tomb was empty, it's because someone moved the body. Well, I agree that historians have to use a scientific view of reality. But a scientific view of reality cannot, by its very nature, rule out the possibility of supernatural divine acts. All a scientific view of reality can state is that dead people don't come back by natural causes. Okay, that's all a scientific view of reality can say. But a scientific view of reality cannot say that God cannot raise someone from the dead. They would be stepping outside of science to do that. So what Tabor is unknowingly doing is he is not weighing in with the evidence, he's weighing in with his atheistic worldview. And the problem is bad philosophy corrupts good history. So he makes a philosophical error there, in philosophy of history, and then, he's going to reject the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because he says that's 4th century, but then he goes with a 16th century Kabbalistic rabbi who says that Jesus was buried in Galilee.
What's the payoff of this theory? Like, why would you even want to do that? Say that he was buried in Galilee. What does that give you?
Well, it would. I mean, I don't know Tabor's mind here or his motivation. So I'm not attributing this to him, but I'd say usually any book that comes out that presents a view of Jesus and the origins of Christianity that is significantly different from the traditional view is something that sells a lot of books. And so, I mean, you could come up and make some kind of claim, and they'll say, oh, well, this guy is a bona fide scholar, and he's giving some reasons to distrust the biblical accounts, and you can sell a bunch of books that way. Again, I'm not saying that this is Tabor's view. I don't know why he came up with this view. Obviously, that he's not a believer in the resurrection of Jesus, but it is interesting that you're going to require such strict evidence to believe the traditional view, while just being gullible entirely gullible. You become uncritical, and you lose a critical thinking mind, and accept something for which there's so less evidence.
Yeah, that's such a weird thing. All right, so let's do what is the number 3 or really the worst?
The worst would have to be this. A year after Tabor's book, you had Simcha Jakubowicz and Charles Pellegrino came out with a book, The Jesus Family Tomb. And there they posited that the Talpiot tomb that was discovered in Jerusalem. It's called in Talpiot, Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
A little village in Jerusalem named Talpiot. That there was a tomb, a family tomb discovered there, and it had some ossuaries in it, bone boxes. The thing that happened in Jerusalem, it was between the years 30 BC and 70 AD, that Jews would receive a proper burial. They'd come back to, say, a tomb. 1 year later, after the body had decomposed, they'd collect the bones, they'd put it in these ossuaries, these bone boxes that were approximately 2 feet long, 2 feet high, and 1.5 feet wide. And they'd put the bones in there, and then they'd give that a proper burial in a tomb somewhere. So you had this family tomb in Talpiot, and it contained ossuary of Joseph, a guy named Joseph, a guy named Jesus, and then he claimed that there was Mary Magdalene, that her ossuary was in there, and it said this Mary Magdalene had been the wife of Jesus, and so Jesus had actually married Mary Magdalene. They had kids, and this was their family tomb.
I need to look at this. Hang on.
Yeah.
It says forward by James Cameron. Is
Yeah.
that the director
Of the Titanic. Yep.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So he got involved in it as well.
Okay.
So, I mean that's just a wild hypothesis,
Yeah.
and there's lots of problems with it.
Yeah. Tell me just a couple.
Well,
What's like the biggest problem with it?
well, the biggest problem would be that through historical investigation, and something that is accepted by virtually 100%, a heterogeneous consensus of New Testament scholars and historians, is that Jesus' disciples, shortly after his death, they sincerely believed that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. So if they had, as these guys were proposing, his family reburied the body, well, then they wouldn't have believed that he had been resurrected, right?
Yeah.
At least bodily raised from the dead.
Right.
They wouldn't think that. But the fact is, the disciples did believe, the earliest Christians believed that Jesus had been raised bodily, so it cannot account for that. Now, some will say, well, they saw visions of Jesus. They didn't think he'd been raised bodily. I can address that if you'd like. But anyway, I think that's one of the big problems.
Address that.
Okay, well, our earliest author, perhaps in the New Testament, is Paul. And so Paul clearly believes in bodily physical resurrection. So you come to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, and he says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised with a resurrection body. When are we going to be raised? Well, 3 verses later, it says, each in his own order. Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So Christ was raised, resurrected in the year 30 or 33, and then we're going to be raised, believers, followers of Jesus are going to be raised when he returns. So, and you come to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which was probably written before 1 Corinthians, probably in the late 40s. And in there, Paul says, look, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. And he talks about, our loved ones, our friends, they die, what happens? And he says, Christ will bring back with him those who belong to him. So he's going to bring back with him, in other words, the spirits. So like my mom and dad are both dead. They died 6 and 7 years ago. So according to Paul, if I were to go and dig up their graves now, their bodies would be there, right? Decomposed bodies. But their spirits, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord, 2 Corinthians 5:8. And Paul talks in Philippians chapter 1 that you can die and be with Christ immediately, all right? Or remain on in the body, were the options for him. So there's no soul sleep. It's a matter of you die, your spirit leaves your body and goes to be with Christ. And according to 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 17, Christ is going to bring back with him the spirits of believers. And then he says, the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing the dead back with him, then what's being raised? Well, it could only be the corpses. So when Christ returns, according to Paul, the spirits of dead believers he brings back with him, and then those spirits are put back into the corpse, and that corpse is raised and transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body. That's bodily resurrection. And Paul says that we're going to be raised as Christ was raised. That's physical, bodily resurrection.
Okay, so
just what the Gospels are talking about, right? So there's no difference between what Paul's believing about the nature of resurrection and what the Gospels are telling us. So it's not a vision that these apostles are seeing, Jesus' disciples, right after the resurrection.
So we're gonna do like one more. Didn't we discuss that? Doing like a kind of.
Oh yeah.
Just one. But before we do that,
I need to tell you one thing though about this, because
go for it.
All right. So here's another problem. Being married to Mary Magdalene. Well, why does he think this was Mary Magdalene that was in the grave? Because the name on the ossuary is Mariamne, and that's not Mary. That's a different name. And then but he says it's Mary Magdalene.
Because.
Okay. Just because that's what he says. Okay, there's no evidence for it. But then he points to the Gospel of Philip, which I believe is 3rd century.
Okay.
And you go there, and that's the only other document I know of that has something that's close to Mariamne. But it's not Mariamne, it's Mariami. It's a little different name, but let's just say it's the same thing. Okay? Here, the problem is it doesn't talk about Mariami being the former wife or the widow of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
She is
in that book.
That's right. She's the sister of the Apostle Philip.
Mm.
And
so there's no reason to be buried in a family tomb.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this would have been perhaps shortly after Jesus was raised.
Mm-hmm. She's
still going around, so when she died, she could have been buried in that tomb if that had been the case and she had been his wife. But here's the problem with it. She doesn't. The Gospel of Philip doesn't identify her as being the former wife of Jesus. And here's what's funny. She is going around and telling people that if you want to become a Christian, you can't get married. So if you're single, you can't get married because sex is bad. You can't get married. And if you are already married, you have to get divorced. Now, why would it be that this former wife of Jesus, obviously if Jesus had been married, then he had no problems with marriage, right? But why is his widow now going around saying you can't be married? In fact, if you are married, to be a follower of Jesus, you've got to be divorced, whereas Jesus clearly talks against divorce. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, don't Barnabas and I have the right to take on a believing wife, just as Peter, the rest of the apostles, and the Lord's brothers. So all the apostles, all of Jesus' brothers, all of the apostles, including Peter, were married. And wouldn't this be a perfect opportunity that if Jesus had been married, like he would have said, and the Lord himself. So, I mean, there's just no reason at all to believe that Jesus was married. This is just, you know what? I remember there was a guy, he came on, and when this thing came out back in 2007, he called it archaeoporn. He says, you want to like it, but you know it's wrong. Jonathan Reed said that.
Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to do one more, but I wanted to let you guys know, if you're watching this and you want to get a chance to ask Mike Licona a question about the resurrection, historical case that can be made for the resurrection, leave it in the live chat. If you want to send it as a super chat, we will most likely get to it. We won't be here super long, but if you have a question for him, burning question, leave it in the live chat. And give me your last one.
Honorable mention. Well, we have three.
Mention.
So there's honorable mention, and that comes from Barbara Turin. And she is a New Testament scholar, a member of the Jesus Seminar, which is a leftist group. But she is so far to the left that a lot even of the Jesus Seminar wouldn't identify with her. She thinks that, and as far as I know, she's the only scholar in the world in the relevant field who thinks this, that Jesus survived his crucifixion. They took him off the cross alive. It's the old swoon theory or apparent death theory. And while he was in the tomb, they put herbs on him like aloe and other herbs, and it healed him. And then he ran off with Mary Magdalene, and they had children in southern France. And of course, there's problems with that, just like we said with 1 Corinthians chapter 9. there's no reason to believe that Jesus was married. And if aloe and other herbs had such healing properties that they could heal a person who had been scourged to the bone and then crucified and bring them back to life, why aren't we using these herbs and things in our hospitals today? Burn victims and all kinds of things. I mean, if this can help with scourging and crucifixion, I mean, this is just amazing healing powers in these things. Why aren't we using them today?
Yeah, that sounds...
So nobody takes her seriously on this,
that
and neither should they.
All right, let's get to some questions. So we have one from Edward Art Supply Hands. Let me actually move this down. I don't have this formatted on this screen, so here we go. All right, that should look better. Okay, he says, does the Old Testament say the Messiah would die and rise? That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, Edward. So there are certain texts. All we can do is we go with some texts that the New Testament authors seem to cite. So like Psalm 2 that says, you are my son, today I have begotten you. I believe that's Psalm 2. And then there's Psalm 16:10. Psalm 16:10 that says, Paul quotes this in Acts 13, where he says, you will not allow your Holy One to see decay. Now, these are the two that are quoted by the earliest Christians. But here's the thing. The Psalm 2, you are my son, today I have begotten you, which is quoted in the early sermon summaries in the book of Acts, that is not referring to the Messiah. That was a coronation hymn to be sung to a king when he was being coronated. So on that day of coronation, they would sing that to him. But what the early Christians did is they reapplied that to Jesus. And then you have Psalm 16:10. It's David who has his life threatened and being pursued, and he's basically saying, you're not going to allow your Holy One, and David's thinking of himself, to see decay, to see the grave. In other words, he believes God's going to rescue him from his enemies and he's not going to be killed. But Paul takes that and reapplies that to Jesus and say, look, David, it couldn't be applying to David because David died, was buried, his body decayed. We know where his grave is. But Jesus died, was buried. His body did not decay, but God raised him up, and to that we're all eyewitnesses. So what we have is the early New Testament writers or early Christians, and they are taking these Old Testament texts, which do not really relate to the Messiah, and they, through creative exegesis, they are relating them to Jesus. So, I mean, we can look at this 2,000 years later and say, well, is that a legitimate thing to do? Because we wouldn't do it today. But they did do these things back then. And, whatever view you take on it, be that. But I don't think that there are any clear Old Testament texts that talk about a dying and rising Messiah, at least one ahead of the general resurrection.
Okay, we have a question here from
At least
Billy.
nothing that's clear.
Billy Boy Bob Yell, looks like. What does Licona think about the two different endings of Mark? Which is the original?
Actually, there are three different endings. So there's the one that ends at chapter 16, verse 8, which says, after the angel had told the women that Jesus had been raised, to go tell the disciples and Peter that he's been raised, and he's gone ahead of them to Galilee, and they're to go there and see him just as he told them, referring back to chapter 14, verse 28. And it says, in verse 8, it says, and they fled, and out of fear, trembling, said nothing to no one. And that's how it ends at verse 8. Now, granted, that is a very abrupt ending, doesn't have any appearances or anything. Why would you end there? So then you have two other endings. There's the longer ending, and that talks about, picking up poisonous snakes and drinking poison and things like this. And almost all scholars would say that's not authentic. And then there's a shorter ending in it that's got something about the Emmaus disciples, and it's a very truncated version of that, some other things and appearances. And, almost all scholars say neither the shorter and longer additional endings are authentic. So what they go with is they say, did it end at chapter 16, verse 8? Well, that's where we have. So did the original Mark end there? Or was the original ending lost? Or did Mark intend to write more to it, but he was unable to because he got sick or thrown into prison or died or something like that? And we really don't know. A slight majority today would say that Mark intended to end at 16:8. But there are a number of significant scholars that would say, no, there was either a longer ending that had the appearances and so forth.
And that was just lost.
It was either lost or Mark was unable to complete it. So
what would that look like? Like he was, like the scroll ran out or something?
Well, he's unable to complete it because he got sick or something,
Oh,
or
okay.
died. And I think that's entirely. I mean, we might find. We know that Matthew and Luke use Mark extensively. Who knows? We might have that ending. A lot of Mark's ending, if Mark's ending was lost, a lot of that might be preserved by Matthew. And it could be that Mark ended it at chapter 16, verse 8. Although I tend to think not. But a lot of scholars do. But there's no agreement on why. It's kind of like where you say if there's two rabbis, there's three different opinions. Well, if there's 50 different New Testament scholars talking about this, there's 60 different opinions. It's one of those things. We just don't know why.
It seems like it's just going to have to come down to speculation almost. It's like, it would make sense if it happened this way or that way, but no one's going to be really that sure about it.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right.
But here's why Billy is asking an important question, though. Because Mark doesn't have the appearances, and then so you'll have some scholars say that the appearance traditions were separate, that Matthew and Luke added those later, as did John. The earliest gospel, Mark, didn't have the appearances. But the thing is, you probably got Paul's letters that are written probably before Mark, and they've got the appearances in there. And in chapter 14, verse 28 in Mark, Jesus tells them that after he's been raised from the dead, they are to go to Galilee and he will meet them there. And that's why the angel says in 16:7, tell the disciples and Peter, he has gone ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. So the appearances are predicted by Mark. And I do think that there's exceptional evidence that Mark, the traditional authorship is correct, and that Mark's primary source was Peter. So Peter would have known about these appearances as well. Anyway, I think we've got really good evidence to suggest that the hypothesis that would say that Mark's group of Christians, Mark the author, would not have known about the appearances. There's really, that's far-fetched.
All right, we have a super chat from Daniel Finlay. He says, is it wise to use the shroud as a piece of evidence for the reresurrection? It's a very good question. In fact, we were just talking about it.
Yeah, so
We'll talk about what the Shroud of Turin is first, for anyone who doesn't know.
Shroud of Turin is this cloth, an ancient cloth that dates back very, very early. In fact, there are sources that go back, closer to the time of Christ that talks about this burial cloth of Jesus that's being shown. Now, and this cloth is a three-dimensional negative photograph. Now, you would know what that is because you're a professional photographer, and I know what it is because I'm an old guy. But a lot of people out here who are taking photographs with their iPhones have no idea what a negative is. Well, there used to be film in cameras. They weren't digital. And a negative is, everything was opposite. So people are looking at their screen now. Well, colors that are, like your shirt. You've got a light-colored shirt with dark stripes. It would be opposite. So it would be a dark-colored shirt with white stripes on. Everything would be opposite. That is a negative. And then once the negative is processed, then you get the color or whatever.
Yeah.
So the Shroud of Turin is actually a negative. So everything is reversed on it.
It's a negative before anyone knew anything about negatives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it is of this figure who had been crucified. He's got nail prints. He's been scourged. He's got bleeding around the head, which would be indicative of like the crown of thorns and things like this.
So one of the biggest problems that I've seen with the shroud is that, first of all, it doesn't even show up in our records until about the 12th century, the 11th, 12th century.
I'm not sure.
Well,
I think it's mentioned before then, though.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the biggest piece of evidence though is the carbon dating that happened. Was it in the 80s?
Yep.
It was fairly recently.
88, I think.
The thing is though, and this is what people who defend the shroud will say, is that oh, well, the samples that they took from the corners were tainted. And part of the reason for that is that there had been a fire that happened in one of the churches that it was held in.
Yep.
And so they did some repair to
Yep.
the corners that they took samples from. And so it would make sense that a carbon dating would give you a date that went to that around that time. So it's a really, really interesting, fascinating piece of cloth.
Yeah, and there's a lot that can be said about this. I mean, I'll just say this because you may want to move on, but Barry Schwartz is Jewish, and he is not a Christian, and he was the professional photographer on the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin research project team, back in the late 70s when they actually examined the shroud, and they thought they were going to go in, and a couple weeks later they're going to show that this was an absolute forgery, and they walked away having no idea whatsoever on how this image got on the shroud. I mean, it's three-dimensional. They've found pollen on it, which is indigenous to Jerusalem around April, around that time. They found dirt on the bottom of the feet that are from caves in Jerusalem. All kinds of things on this. And anyway, what Barry Schwartz has said, and by the way, he has contributed an excellent essay with some groundbreaking stuff people are going to find very fascinating. Remember, this guy is not a Christian. This guy is Jewish. He's not a Christian. He's worked with the Shroud team. He thinks that the Shroud probably belonged to Jesus. And he won't say that he thinks Jesus was raised. He'll say he has no idea how it got there. But here's what Schwartz says. He gives reason, and this is coming out in a Festschrift for Gary Habermas, published by Lexham Press, and it's coming out this fall. Okay? And he's got an essay in it talking about the Shroud, and he shows how the carbon dating testing that was done on the Shroud is absolutely flawed and cannot be considered as credible at all, the particular one that they did. It's awesome what this essay that he did.
Well, so tell me, like, what is your answer to his question? Like, can you use this as evidence for the resurrection?
I don't know. I don't use it. When I'm
as
talking.
Cool as it is, maybe it's not necessary.
I don't think it's necessary, but I think for a lot of people, they're going to look at it, especially maybe some Protestants who haven't. They don't like Catholics like our friend Matt here. I love Catholics. Okay. I think they're wrong in some things, but he's my brother. Catholics are my brother and sisters in Christ, they're going to say, well, this is just one of those Catholic relics, and then just throw it away. And I think that's just crazy. You got to look at the evidence for it. I think, and here's something Gary Habermas says. I love it. He says, if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we've got a photograph of the resurrection. That's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Matt, is the Catholic position like officially that this is official good? No?
No, it's a sort of skeptical take. I think it's a scientific question, so it's not a question for faith to resolve.
Okay. Well, let's get to just a couple more questions here, and then we're going to close it out. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time today, unfortunately. From Praise Jesus, well, this is more just a comment from him, but thank you for sending in a super chat. He says, I believe the Shroud is authentic. GBU, guys? What is that? What is GBU?
God bless you.
God bless you. There you go.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Makes sense.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, let's get to one more. So someone's asking about Paula Diaz theory. I don't know if you are familiar with him or his theory. Yeah, unfortunately, what most of the work that you do is looking at what other scholars have said, right? Not what YouTubers say. So, all right, here, I'm trying to find another question up here. Let me scroll up just a little bit. Okay, here's a good question from William Keller, and we'll end on this one. What is the evidence that the disciples didn't make it up?
Well, we've got really good evidence that the disciples were willing to suffer and even willing to die for their proclamation that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them. I can think of a few. So you got Luke, who mentioned, you got that they were willing to suffer and die. That is in the book of Acts. You've got Tertullian. You've got John. At the end of John's gospel, you have Jesus telling Peter the kind of death he's going to die by crucifixion. John says, by telling Peter he's going to stretch out his hands, he said this was to signify the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And John is writing a few decades after Peter's death. So he is reporting about Peter's death there. So you got Luke, Tertullian, John. You got Dionysius of Corinth, Origen, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome. They mention how these disciples were willing to suffer continuously. All of them were. And they were willing to die. And in fact, at least some of them did die. James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, Peter, and probably some others. Now, some of the reports of the martyrdoms of some of the disciples are late. And so we don't know. They might be true, they may not be. But we can at least say Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus. So they died deaths of martyrs. We got enough evidence for those. But if you see, it's kind of like if the three of us, okay, Matt, Cameron, and Mike, if all of a sudden, let's say someone comes into this room as we're talking, let's say a terrorist comes in and says, oh, you guys are Christians. All right, Matt, are you a believer? Will you deny Christ or I'm going to kill you? And you say, no, I'm a believer. And he kills you. And then he says, Cameron, are you a believer? If you say, yes, I'm going to kill you. And you say, I am. And they kill you. And they say, Mike, are you a believer? And I say, yes. But just then my wife shoots the terrorist. So I didn't die as a believer, but I was willing to. So the fact is the disciples were willing to die. They see Peter, they see Paul, they see James die, but yet they persist to go out and preach the same gospel message. So even if they didn't die as martyrs, they were still willing to. And liars make poor martyrs, right? So the fact that they were willing to suffer continuously and willing to be martyred for their gospel proclamation suggests that they were not only claiming that Jesus rose and appeared to them, they actually believed it.
All right, let's end on that one. And how can people find out more about your work, stuff that you do?
Well,
your YouTube channel, what's the name of it?
YouTube channel, just type in Mike Licona. Go to YouTube and you'll find my channel. We got some really cool stuff that's already out and coming out. Like we've got a series called Fly on the Wall, where we get to hang out. Anyway, it's pretty cool. So yeah, go there, subscribe, hit that little bell icon so you can be notified when we have a new video. We've got David Wood on Fly on the Wall coming out.
Oh, nice.
Next week, next Thursday, and after that, Tim Stratton, and then after that, we've got a real special one, and Ron Sauer. He was my Greek professor. He was the final doctoral student of F.F. Bruce, and he tells us what it was like to study under F.F. Bruce. But also, I can tell you, Ron Sauer is just an amazing scholar of the Greek language, reading the Greek New Testament, and so inspirational. And and I interviewed him after not seeing him for 34 years. Really a special guy. Looking forward to that. So that's coming out. Also, our website's risenjesus.com.
There you go. Can
I say one other thing real quick?
Yeah.
Hey, we got we've got some great programs at Houston Baptist University where I teach. Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics. We have a Master of Arts in Theological Studies. We have a Master of Divinity, and we have a Master of Arts in Philosophy. And all of them, I believe, I'm not quite sure about the Master of Arts in Philosophy, but all the other degrees can be completed completely online. They are fully accredited. So you can do it from your home. I've had students from Kenya, from Germany, around the world who have been students. And so, yeah, those programs are available. Just go to hbu.edu. You can find out about it.
Cool. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Someone sent in a $10 super chat. Thank you, Benjamin. His question is, what's your opinion of Matthew 27:52 through 53, the passage that everyone wants to know about? The bodies of many saints being raised at Jesus' resurrection, entering Jerusalem, and appearing to many people. It seems a bit out of place. And you've talked about this, in
I got in trouble for it.
Yeah,
several years ago.
Well, so what do you want to do? Do you want to just give your view one more time?
I don't mind. Sure. So when I was doing my doctoral research, this comes up because one skeptical scholar had written that he thinks that this is the clearest case of myth making in the New Testament. And granted, Matthew is the only one who mentions this in the New Testament. So what about these guys? So I look at it, and I was doing some research on it in my doctoral work and said, all right, well, were these alleged saints raised at Jesus' death? Did they have a resurrection body or no? Were they raised like Lazarus only to die again? Well, if they were raised in a resurrection body, that would contradict Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that says Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. The first to be raised with the resurrection body. These would have been raised prior to Jesus' resurrection. So then you're looking and say, well, were they raised in the same kind of bodies? Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son, only to get sick and die again. So let's just say it's that. Well, they are raised when Jesus dies on Friday afternoon, say around 3 o'clock. But they don't come out of their tombs, according to Matthew, until after Jesus is raised Sunday morning. It's at least 40 hours later. So what are they doing in the meantime? And if you'd been there, would you see them pacing back and forth in their caves? Would they be talking to one another? And when they came out, now they're homeless, they're hungry, they're thirsty because they haven't eaten or drank anything for at least 40 hours. They go into Jerusalem, they're homeless, they start to talk to people, and hey, where are you from, partner? And he says, well, I live right down the street next to Solomon's house. What? And why is it we don't hear about these guys anymore? They're just maybe alluded to a couple of times in the, hey, your thing's frozen. They're just alluded to a few times by the early church fathers.
Oh, there it is.
So I don't know. I think it's more likely that what we have here are what are called portents.
Portents?
Portents. And this is something that the ancients did a lot of. You got Plutarch doing it. You got Josephus. Josephus reports that just before the temple was destroyed, that there was a comet, that there was an eclipse of the sun, that the gates to the temple, which took more than 20 men to opened by themselves, that a cow gave birth to a lamb, that fighting was seen in the heavens. Well, when Caesar goes into Egypt, we find similar portents being said by Cassius Dio. When Caesar is assassinated, we have a number of the ancient authors report eclipses of the sun, comets, things like this. But Virgil, who is definitely writing poetry, he mentions, I think, 13 or 16 of these things, like black intestines were seen outside of cattle, that Mount Etna erupted, there was a comet, that pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. And the same kind of stuff you're seeing with these things. And in fact, Cassius Dio, when Caesar goes into enslaves Egypt, he says that the gates to the temple of Jupiter, Zeus, which took many men to open by themselves. So you see a number of these things going on, and it's not that these things actually happen. It's like, it'd be kind of like maybe the closest thing we do today is to say 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. It's not to say that there was an earthquake on that day. This is just phenomenological language we do to emphasize what happened at that event. And so Matthew, if he is using these as portents, it would just be to say, wow, this is because you've just killed the Son of God.
Kind of like apocryphal language. Is that how you'd? Yeah. So I was reading a commentary. Man, I can't remember the name.
Apocalyptic language.
Yeah. I was reading a commentary on Matthew. I was studying the book of Matthew about a year ago at this point, and he mentioned that we don't really have enough evidence to determine one way or the other whether or not this is apocryphal language or if it's something else. So he was personally undecided about it, which I think is a perfectly legitimate position to take.
I don't know that we can be sure. In fact, what's interesting, say, well, if that's the raised saints, well, what about the darkness? What about the earthquake? What about the temple veil splitting? I don't know. I mean, here's the problem. I got a book right back there on my shelf. It's a catalog of comets reported in the Greco-Roman literature from the 5th century BC through the 4th century. It's written by John Ramsey, who has since become a good friend, a classicist. And he shows in there how there are a number of these comets that were reported that were used as portents.
Comets? Comets.
Yeah. So like the Hale-Bopp comet or Halley's comet.
Oh.
All right. And some of them, we know that these comets actually appeared at that time. Like there was one that appeared close to the time of the temple destruction of the temple. There was one that appeared close to the time or during the same year that Julius Caesar was assassinated. However, here's another thing. You can go, NASA has a website. I've got the link. It's either in my book or on my website. If you go to the search and type in roundtable, it will bring up an article that I did for the Southeastern Theological Review with a number of others. It was a roundtable, and we had a discussion on this. And I either provide a link in there or in my book or in both. And NASA has a website you can go to, and you can type in a year, and you can click on a geographical region, and it will tell you whether there was an eclipse of the sun that was visible that year in that region. And what you can do is you can go and compare and say, okay, there are certain accounts that say an eclipse of the sun and a comet occurred as portents for this event. And we can confirm that the comet occurred, was visible. But we can also confirm that there was no visible eclipse of the sun that year there. So, which shows that these ancient authors would sometimes commingle actual historical phenomena with portents, or ones that were fictitious, in order to highlight this thing. And so that makes it doubly difficult to know what Matthew was doing here.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for coming on to do this show on 3 really, really weird theories about the resurrection. Yeah, some of those, the twin brother theory is just so ridiculous to me. But I mean, the others are equally as ridiculous, I would say. But let me mention this. So if you've been following my work and you want to support, and right now we're doing a giveaway, and we're giving away 4 different DVD sets from the Credo course, and from Credo course, and one of those is Christian Apologetics from Douglas Groothuis. We have the Reliability of the Gospels. This slide doesn't make any sense. I'll put it up in just a minute. We're giving away some really, really cool stuff. I don't want to get too involved in it right now. But if you want to enter into this giveaway, which isn't necessarily a giveaway because it's going to apply to anybody who's already a Berean, and this will make sense to put it up here, we have a private Facebook group. And so if you are a patron of Capturing Christianity, you can gain access to the Bereans group on Facebook. We have a lot of cool discussions and just hang out in there. It's a really good time. And so if you are a patron, you can join the Facebook group, and we're giving away 4 different Credo Course DVDs to one person at random that is already in the group. So if you're already a patron of Capturing Christianity, you don't have to do anything. You're already entered. If you want to gain access to the group, then just become a patron, and you can join us that way. So wanted to mention that before we head out. But again, thanks for coming on, Mike, and I can't wait to do more work together. So is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience?
No, it's just, I love what you're doing. Love what you are doing, what Matt's doing. You guys have fantastic channels, and I'd encourage people to help support you on it, because it's important work that the 2 of you are doing.
Appreciate it. All right, well, I'll see you guys later. And by the way, do you know my slogan? You don't know my slogan. By the way, Christianity is true. You'll have it for next time. You'll have it for next time. It's all good.
Christianity is true.